Good day, everyone. So, welcome again to our subject foundation of special and inclusive education. So, this is the chapter 2 of our lesson. So, we are going to discuss the addressing diversity through the years, special and inclusive education. So, this for today's discussion, it will allow you to look at special needs and inclusive education from historical and philosophical context. So, the first step to becoming an effective special needs and or inclusive teachers lies not in one's skills to teach strategically, but in one's willingness and commitment to respect individual differences. So, as seen in our previous discussion, diversity is a natural part of every environment and must be perceived as given rather than an exception. So let us now proceed to our first discussion. So the concept of disability has been existent for ages. So the Bible chronicles the presence of persons who are blind and crippled who needed to be healed. Cultural narratives like the Hunchbacks of Notre Dame and Campanerang Cuba depict disability as a source of fear and ridicule. So even Philippine history has records of disability through the Apolinario Mabini, who was unable to walk because of a physically impairing condition called poliomyelitis. So clearly, disability cuts across countries, cultures, and timelines, but perhaps it is part of human nature to react negatively to anything perceived as different or out of the ordinary. So there is often resistance, especially when people are met with situations that they are unfamiliar with. So persons with disabilities or the PWDs are not exempted from this type of treatment. So how PWDs were once treated is not something any nation would be proud of. So historically, people formed opinions and reactions towards disability in a similar pattern. So it was consistent for almost every country. So society first took notice of those with physical disabilities because they immediately stood out. Then they noticed those with less apparent developmental conditions because they acted differently. So as soon as the deviants were identified, segregation, exclusion, the isolation, and other forms of violence and cruelty followed. So prior to the age of enlightenment in the 1700s, which are now considered discriminatory and violating of human rights, were evident in all aspects of community, so living spaces, healthcare, education, and work. So, for instance, there was a time when the status of PWDs was in questions. So, in earlier times, PWDs were seen as the social threats capable of contaminating an otherwise pure human species. So, therefore, as much as communities needed to be protected from them, PWDs also had to be protected from the society. So, some people saw them as um, menaces, so while others treated them as objects of dread, pity, entertainment, or ridicule. So, at best, they were put on pedestal and perceived as wholly innocents or eternal children who could do no wrong. So at worst, they were killed or treated as subhumans devoid of any rights. So sociology reminds us that human behavior must always be studied in relation to cultural, historical, and sociocultural context. So, in fact, the best way to understand why people think or act the way they do is by looking at what was happening to their community at a certain point in time. So, events tend to shape one's beliefs and value system. So, as such, it is important that we examine historical highlights to appreciate one's perspectives on disability. So this is the evolution of models of disability. So Smart Study during the 2004 emphasizes that models of disability are important as they serve several purposes. So number one is they provide definitions of disability. They offer explanations of causal and responsibility attributions. They are based on perceived needs. They inform policy. They are not value neutral. They define the academic disciplines that focus on disability, and they shape the self identity of PWDs. So they can provide insight on how prejudices and discriminations occur. So this last statement in particular has proven to be very powerful in helping us see how, to a certain extent, so society is unconsciously led to respond to disability. So first, let's discuss the moral and the religious model. So the medieval age is said to have started from the AD 476, so the year of the Western Roman Empire fell and ended toward the early 1800s, eventually ushering in the Renaissance age and age of discovery. So this period saw the church as one of the most influential figures in Europe. So the idea of God as an all-powerful being was so strong in man's consciousness that it affected the way society treated PWDs at the time. So parents who bore children with disabilities were seen from within the spectrum, where on one end, God was punishing them for a sin that needed to be atoned. So at the other extreme, he was blessing the family by giving them a precious gift that only they could care for. So the middle ground was to see disability as a test of faith and an opportunity to redeem oneself through endurance, resilience, and pity. So such perspectives are rooted in the moral or religious model of disabilities, so which sees disability as either a blessing or a curse. So it is characterized by notions of charity and caretaking. So however, Jackson adds that protection is also a primary concern as there is an instinct to protect both persons with disabilities for their vulnerability and the economic and social order which might be disrupted by deviant members of the society. So it is considered the oldest model of disability and is evident in many religious traditions. So, for instance, the biblical scripture would refer to persons with chronic illness like leprosy as unclean, while those considered demonically possessed may actually have had mental illnesses, so or seizure disorders. So in one strand of the moral religious model, disability is equated with the sin, the evilness, or the spiritual ineptness of either the PWD or of a PWD's family member. So such as belief can then cause not just the PWD's isolation but also the exclusion of the entire family unit from the communal events. So on the other hand, for those who view disability as a blessing, disability either becomes one ticket to heaven or an opportunity toward character development. So, in addition, some cultures who ascribe to a moral religious model of disability may also lean toward a type of mystical narrative. So, their belief is that disabilities may impair some senses yet heighten others, thereby granting him or her special abilities to perceive, reflect, transcend, and be spiritual. So, for the most part, the core response to this model was the establishing of segregated institutions where PWDs could be kept. So, in the United States or the United Kingdom and Australia, asylums for the mentally ill, the retardedness, the degenerates, and defectives were built. So segregated residential schools and workhouses with dormitories located miles away from town centers were also erected. So although the moral religious model is not as dominant now as it used to be during the medieval times, the perspective is still reflected in some places where religion plays a huge influence on a daily life. So, aside from the moral religious model of disability, we have also the biomedical or individual model. So, historians and scientists alike consider the Copernican revolution, that is the discovery of the Nicholas Copernicus, that the center of the universe was the sun and not the earth. So, this is one of most controversial yet significant discoveries of all time. So it was revolutionary and bold because it dared to contradict the Bible as well as then considered the fundamental truth. But it was a breakthrough that triggered major changes in the field of science, the philosophy, the theology, and the education. So most evident was its contribution to scientific and technological advancement. So most evident was its contribution to scientific and again technological advancement. What was not as apparent was how it paved the way for people to also shift mindsets from a religious perspective to a more evidence-based model of disability. So that is the biomedical or the medical model. So in here, PWDs are seen as person who are ill and meant to be treated or made more normal. So, disability is seen as a medical problem that resides in the individual. So, it is a defect in or failure of a bodily system, and as such, is inherently abnormal and pathological. So, the goal of the intervention are cure of the physical condition to the greatest extent possible and rehabilitation. So, for example, the adjustment of the person with a disability to the condition and to the environment. So, persons with disabilities are expected to avail themselves of the variety of services offered to them and to spend time in the role of patient or learner being helped by trained professionals. So, whereas moral religious perspective sees disability as something permanent. So the biomedical model considers disability as the glitch. So the PWD is born into which needs assessment and fixing. While Oliver refers to the model as the individual model. So based on the person's levels of deficiency compared to a normative state. So, a perspective pushes forth the idea that PWDs have problems. So, it also reinforces the notions that those without disabilities, so for example, the able bodied or typically developing, are superior than those with disabilities, and that they have a primary responsibility over the welfare of the disabled. So most interventions are thus devoted to making sure that the PWD catches up with the his or her peers, a practice that is very much ingrained in society to this day. So we have here the medical model of disability. So it was during the 15th century when more schools for PWDs started to emerge in Peru. So this first special school were built by private philanthropic institutions, although they initially catered only to those with sensory impairments such as the deafness and blindness. So other schools soon started accepting other disability types into their student roster. So interestingly, the curriculum for such education institutions was different from that of public schools. So in special schools, the main focus was on building the vocational schools of students, a clear sign that the biomedical model sees PWDs as different from the majority. So the idea of institutionalizing or bringing PWDs to asylums or hospitals for custodial care when they have become too difficult to manage, also reached its peak with the reinforcement of biomedical model. So we are done discussing about the religious model, and now we have the biomedical. Now we will proceed to the functional rehabilitation model. So the scientific breakthroughs experienced from the time of Copernicus up until the early 1900s brought about changes in all aspects of life, including warfare and the concept of power. So when World War I happened, communities witnessed perfectly healthy people live to serve the country only to come back disabled physically, neurologically, or mentally. So it was then that people started to realize that not all disabilities are inborn. So physical and occupational therapies soon become prevalent modes of rehabilitation for much of the service-related injuries the soldiers sustained. So the functional rehabilitation model is quite similar to the biomedical model in that it sees the PWD as having deficits. So this deficit then justified the need to undergo rehabilitative interventions such as therapies, counseling, and the like in the aim of reintegrating the disabled into the society. So the main difference between the two models is in the concept of habilitation and rehabilitation. So the biomedical model often suggests habilitation, which refers to help given to those whose disabilities are congenital or manifested very early in life in order to maximize function. So, on the other hand, the functional rehabilitation model refers to the assistance given by professionals to those who have an acquired disability in the hope of gaining back one's functionality. So the biomedical and rehabilitative models, together with the dawn of clinic-based assessment in the 1950s and its proliferation during the 1960s onward, show how much societies has placed value on convention, performance, and achievement. So anyone whose performance does not fall within the norm of a population is automatically deemed different and deficient. So in living spaces, such persons were shunned by society. So in educational settings, such students were advised to transfer schools for a more specialized type of education. In workplaces, they were segregated or refused opportunities. Either way, both models constantly put the PW at a disadvantage. So they become easy targets for PT or recipients of charitable work. Moreover, both promote an expert-client type of relationship between non-disabled and the disabled, where the PWD is automatically perceived as inferior. So at the very least, this relational exchange benefits the client as the expert can help improve his or her state. However, at the extreme, this collaboration undermines the client's dignity by removing the ability to participate in the simplest everyday decisions affecting his or her life. Next model is we have the social model. So what we need to understand about these models and frameworks is that they have strong yet subtle way of influencing a person's beliefs, behaviors, and the value system. So for example, a Filipino born and raised in the United States who comes to the Philippines would most likely act more American than Filipino, not because he resists his roots, but because of his exposure to the Americans, not Filipinos. So he may not have been raised this way intentionally, but constant interaction with others of a particular culture can strongly influence a person's of life. So, according to Clow, points out that the social or the sociological model becomes or became the society's reaction to how the biomedical perceives perspective view disability. So, in fact, Mike Oliver, so a lecturer in the 1980s who coined the term social model, is considered one of its main proponents, wrote a position paper directly reacting against how the medical field has been reinforcing or a disabling view of PWD. So, according to the sociological response, disability occurs as a result of society's lack of understanding of individual differences. So PWDs are seen as disabled not because they are deficient, but because society sees they are deficient and disadvantaged. So norms, after all, are determined by society. So Professor David challenges the concept of norms. So it says here, it depends upon the concept of normal, that is, being a person with disability, which limits my mobility, means that I do not move about in a so called normal way. But what is the normal way to cover a mile? Some people would walk, some people would ride a bicycle, or a bus, or in a taxi, or their own car. Others would use a skateboard or inline rollerblades. Some people use wheelchairs. There is, I argue, no normal way to travel a mile. So the underlying principles of the social model of disability is that disability is a social construct where standards and limitations that society places on specific groups of people are what disable a person. With this perspective, everything from government laws to education to employment opportunities to access to communal facilities take on different meaning. For instance, Mara, a person with paraplegia, a condition that causes impaired functioning of the legs, who uses a motorized wheelchair, should be able to go around on her own. The mayor in her town put up an elevator by the footbridge to help people get to the top easily without having to climb up the stairs. Although there are facilities in the footbridge to get her from one side of the way to the other, she wonders how she could get to the footbridge from her house. So the public transportation unfortunately is not accessible from her home. And even if it were, none of the transports would be able to take a wheelchair. So Jana, on the other hand, also has a paraplegia, but lives in a neighboring town as Maras, where the local government provides shuttle for those with physical disabilities. So she has a wheelchair herself, though it is not motorized. Despite this, Jana is able to go around by herself because her town provide continuous access from one point to the next. So this example shows that what is truly disabling is not the physical condition, the way the medical model would adhere to, but the lack of opportunities and restrictions given to a person as the social model would push for. So we have here the social model of disability. So the World Health Organization differentiates between disability and impairment. So impairment is seen as any loss of abnormality of psychological or anatomical structure or function. Again, please take note of this. When we say impairment, this is seen as any loss or abnormality of psychological or anatomical structure or function. When we say disability, this refers to any restriction or lack, for example, resulting from an impairment of ability to perform an activity in the manner or within the range considered normal for a human being. So most people seem to confuse the two terms. So most of the time equating them to each other. So the social model, however, reiterates that impairment should be seen as normal aspects of life, and when it happens, it should not cause us fear. Instead, society must plan in anticipation of possible impairment occurrences so as not to disable anyone. So Kaplan agrees that if disability were to be seen as something natural and expected, it could change the way we design our systems in our environment. So the cultural habit of regarding the condition of the person, not the built environment or the social organization of activities as the source of the problem runs deep. So, for example, it took me several years of struggling with the heavy door to my building, sometimes having to wait until a person stronger came along to realize that the door was an accessibility problem not only for me but for others as well. And I did not notice until one of my students pointed it out that the lack of signs that could be read from a distance at my university forced people with mobility impairments to expend a lot of energy unnecessarily searching for rooms and offices. Although I have encountered this difficulty myself on days when walking was exhausting to me, I interpreted it automatically as a problem arising from my illness, as I did with the door, rather than a problem arising from the built environment having been created for too narrow a range of people and situations. Next is the rice-based model and twin track approach. So the rice-based model of disability is a framework that bears similarities with the social model. So although most practitioners see the two as one and the same, Degener argues their differences. While the social model reiterates social factors and dynamics that form our perceptions and disability, the right-based model moves beyond explanation, offering a theoretical framework for disability policy that emphasizes the human dignity of PWDs. So it immediately recognizes the PWD's vulnerability and tries to address this by upholding their identity and rights as and so moreover, while the social model is mostly public health policy that advocates the prevention of impairment, the human rights model recognizes property policy may be regarded as an instance of human protection for PWDs. So the right-based approach to education ensures that all energies are devoted to the realization of each learner's right to education. So it is built on the principle that education is human right and therefore all must have access to it. So there are few key actors directly involved in such as model. So number one is the government as duty bearers, the child as the rights holder, the parents not only as the duty bearers but also as representatives of the child, and last is the teachers both as rights holders and duty bearers. So at best, the lobbyists and practitioners now promote a twin track approach which combines the social model and the right-based model. So a marrying of two perspectives allows for holistic changes to occur with the option of promoting individual needs whenever necessary. So for instance, In education, this would mean allowing a PWD to join the mainstream, yet be given opportunities for disability-specific programs in case additional support is needed. So now we are done discussing about the foundations of the special and inclusive education. So the next question would be, what is a special need education? So according to Merriam-Webster Online, defines education as the education or process of teaching someone, especially in school, college, or university. So people typically go through this teaching learning process following a particular sequence. So first, they are educated at home by their parents. Then they go through preschool, which prepares them for a more formal, systematic, and rigorous type of learning. And in elementary, secondary, and tertiary school, people attempt to understand the world through various subjects. So, and different types of knowledge through typically singular teaching strategies. So, most graduates become part of the workforce while others choose to go beyond tertiary education and pursue higher academic degrees. Although there are countless of schools and universities in every country, the education process pretty much stays the same for everyone because the goal remains the same as well. So according to Prinsky, the real goal of education is becoming a more a capable person that when you started. So according naman to William Butler Yeats, in the meantime have said that education is not filling of a pail but the lighting of fire. So either way, the importance of lifelong learning cannot be emphasized enough. Education plays a fundamental role in humans' personal and social development, given that man is both an individual and a social being. So one cannot simply think of the human person outside the context of a community. So it is presumably because of education that the world now faces problems such as poverty, oppression, and war. Yet it is also through education that all these problems are expected to be addressed. So through the pillars of education that the International Commission on Education espouses, that we are taught that education has to address four aspects of learning. Please take down notes of this. Number one is learning in order to know. Second one is learning in order to do. Learning so we can live harmoniously with others, and learning in order to be. So additionally, for the goals of education to be realized, education itself has to be available and accessible to all. So in its totality, the vision of education for humanity is noble and appropriate. However, for any given population, statistical data shows that people possess different aptitude and skills levels of depending on standards or expectation that society ultimately dictates and holds as true. So this is what Claude refers to a pathology of difference. So in a normal distribution, showing student performance would illustrate that there will always be those performing closely with each other, what statisticians and educators call the average population. So, but there will always be those who fall at the tail of the curve. So, those at the extremes would either possess exceptionally high capabilities or extremely low skill levels. Sometimes, this is because of a medical, developmental, or neurological disability that a learner has. Other times, it is because they just happen to be among highly exceptional people. So either way, the fact remains teaching strategies that normally work with the average population will not work the same with those at the extremes. So the students would not be able to learn as fast as much and as well as most. So with scenarios like this, one eventually would have to wonder, how does education address this reality? So this then becomes the very definition of the special education. So historically, special education has been regarded as an attempt to increase the fairness of universal public education for exceptional learners, because there are those with special difficulties or extraordinary abilities in learning. Acknowledging learner differences, the essence of special education lies in its goal to education a certain population of students, particularly those at the tail ends of a normal statistical distribution of performance. So, in other words, special education tries to ensure that those perceived to have difficulties learning will be taught, albeit in a different ways. So, not everyone reacts to learner diversity the same way. So, unfortunately, the default framework societies seem to operate on remains to be the medical model. So, as such, simply asking people to take on a more sociological standpoint appears much more difficult than it seems. It is unclear as to how society is expected to shift paradigms. Moreover, it is questionable if we can even reach that point given the discomfort and resistance others have shown against the social model. It has long been regarded that the key to nation building is quality education accessible to all types of learners. So, this accessibility is the essence of the inclusive education. So, that is what we are going to discuss. Why, after this, what is special education? Why inclusion? So, inclusive education is an educational practice that places students with disabilities in the general education classroom along with typically developing children under the supervision and guidance of a general education teacher. So it takes root in special needs education and is anchored on the philosophy that every children has an inherent right to be educated equally with his peers, no matter how different he or she may appear to society. So the global arena has been consistently vocal in its stand on children, persons with disabilities, and education. So in early as 1948, there have already been worldwide declarations on children and their right to be educated. So that is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 1948, the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child 1989. In 1990, many countries banded together for the World Declaration of Education for All, that is the EFA, which stated that all children must have access to complete, free, and compulsory primary education. So soon after the global arena, the UN standard rules on the equalization of opportunities for persons with disabilities and education was created. So it is in the standard set of rules that each child's right to education was affirmed. It is also in this directive that the importance of providing education in integrated and general school settings was first specified. So this mandate was immediately followed by the landmark policy on special education, the Salamanca Statement and Framework for Action on Special Needs Education, which reiterated that schools should accommodate all children, including the disabled, the gifted, and the marginalized. So these groundbreaking directives eventually formed the foundations of four other initiatives, that is the World Education Forum Framework for Action and the Millennium Summit of the United Nations. So both of which happened in the 2000s. So the EFA flagship on the right to education for PWDs in 2001, the UN Disability Convention in 2005, and the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2006 and the Education 2030 framework for action following the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. All of these were created with the same goal in mind, that is the inclusion. So next would be the guidelines for inclusion that was created during 2005, published by the UNESCO. So enumerates the four key elements. Number one is that inclusion is a process that is a never-ending search to find better ways to respond to diversity. Second one is inclusion involves a preventive dimension, especially in identifying and removing potential barriers to this process through collecting, collating, and evaluating information for improving policy and practice. Third is the inclusion is all about the presence, participation, and achievement or learning outcomes of all types of students. And last is that inclusion puts particular emphasis on learners who may be at risk of marginalization, exclusion, or underachievement. So, and therefore, they must be consistently monitored and represented in the inclusive process. So I have here the inclusion in education involves. So number one is valuing all students and staff equally. Next is increasing the participation of students and reducing their exclusion from the cultures, curricula, and communities of local schools. Restructuring the cultures, policies, and practices in schools so that they respond to the diversity of students in the locality. We have the reducing barriers to learning and participation for all students, not only those with impairments or those who are categorized as having special education needs. Learning from attempts to overcome barriers to the access and participation of a particular students to make changes for the benefit of students more widely. Viewing the difference between students as resources to support learning rather than problems to be overcome. And then acknowledging the right of students to an education in their locality, improving schools for staff as well as for students, and emphasizing the role of schools in building community and developing values as well as in increasing achievement. Fostering mutually sustaining relationships between schools and community, and then recognizing that inclusion in education is one aspect of inclusion in society. I've mentioned earlier the 2030 agenda. So let's talk about the 2030 agenda. So the goal of inclusion is for every fabric of society to embrace diversity. So it is for this reason that all these treaties state that need for a paradigm shift to address the issues of inclusion in education. So the inclusive education is not merely a call toward educational reform for those with additional needs. It is simply a call to improve the quality of education for all learners because every learner matters and matters equally. So this is also reflected in the current framework being followed for the implementation of the inclusive practices, which is the sustainable developmental goals. So the SDGs. So the SDGs are considered roadmaps or blueprints that were developed by the United Nations to ensure a better and sustainable future for everyone. So it consists of 17 global goals set by the United Nations for the year 2030 and each addressing one specific area of development. So of particular interest to the global education community, however, is the SDG 4, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. So therefore,
the need to remove all the barriers to inclusion by addressing all forms of exclusion and marginalization is of utmost importance. So, we have here the Philippine laws for PWD. So, I want you to take note of this. So, we have the BP 344 during 1983. This is the accessibility law. Next is the RA 7277 1992, the Magna Carta for disabled persons. So, the content of this is the equal rights and privileges of PWDs on employment, education, health, telecommunications, auxiliary social services, accessibility, political and civil rights, and also penalties for violations of law. Next is the Administrative Order 35, 2002, the National Disability Prevention and Rehabilitation. Next is the guidelines in the admission of students with disabilities in higher education and post-secondary institutions in the Philippines during the 2004. Next is the RA 9442 2007, the amendment of RA 7277, privileges to PWDs. So this is the content of the RA 9442. 20% discount privileges to PWDs. Change name from the Magna Carta for Disabled Person to Magna Carta for PWDs and added a clause on the deliverance from public ridicule and vilification. Next is the NCDA Administrative Order number 001 series of 2008. So this is the guidelines on the issuance of PWD ID cards relative to RA 9442. Next is the RA 10070 2010 amendment of RA 7277. So this is the implementation of programs and services for PWDs in every province, city, and municipality. Next is RA 10366 2013. This is the accessible polling places for PWDs and senior citizens. The proclamation number 688 series of 2013 declaring the period of 2013-2022 as the Philippine decade of Make the Right Real for PWDs. So we have the RA 10754 2016, the an act expanding the benefits and privileges of PWDs. This is the exemption of VAT on the following sale of goods and services, the inclusion of funeral services. Next is the Civil Service Commission number 20 series of 2017. So this is express lanes for PWDs in all commercial and government establishes. And RA 11228 2019 amendment of RA 7277. So those are the Philippine laws for PWDs. So all PWDs shall be automatically covered by the National Health Insurance Program or the NHIP of the PhilHealth, and the PhilHealth shall develop exclusive packages for PWDs that will address their specific health and development needs. So that's all for today's discussion. So I hope you learned something today. So in any questions, you can chat in our group chat. So I will accommodate all questions only in our official GC. So again, we will schedule your quiz after you study and watch the recorded discussion. So for your performance activity, answer the following questions. So this is consists of 80 points. Put your answer in the comment section below by following the format. Again, I will not accept a personal message. I will not also accept your answers through the personal message or GC. It must be in the comment section below. So, my only reference in checking your performance activity is on the comment section of our recorded discussion. So, if you send me your answer through GC, I will not check that anymore. So, please write your answer in the comment section below. So again, don't forget to write your name first, your block or your cluster, and your answer. So the deadline of submission is on August 23, 2023, 8 o'clock p.m. only. So now, your performance activity number 1. What are the different models of disability? How would each define disability? Next is how are impairments different from disabilities? What is special needs education? How different is it from inclusive education? And which international treatises are directly involved in the pursuit of inclusive education? So again, thank you very much. Thank you very much and see you on the next discussion. Study well.